Welcome to Previously on X-Men, the podcast that looks back on X-Men comics, movies, shows, characters, and more. You can find out more about this show and others like it at our network's website, radiomeanwhile.com. Share your thoughts on this and upcoming episodes by following us on Twitter at PreviouslyOnX. And please rate, subscribe, and share this show wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Hillary Gunning, and today
Hillary.
Hillary. Hey, Nick.
Hey, sorry, is Eric here?
I was just going to start without him and see if he was going to...
Yeah, no, I had the same thought over on Comic Book Coffee Break, but every time I sit down and we click on the thing, all I see is his chair just spinning in an empty room. I don't know where he is.
Huh.
I'm getting a little concerned.
Oh, no.
What?
I told him not to do this.
Do what?
I think he went to the Savage Lands.
The Savage Lands?
Yeah.
Alone?
Well, I mean, he was going to go meet up with Kazar and Shanna and...
Oh, no. Fight Garrick, of course.
Yeah.
Why would he do that alone? He's got the whole Radio Meanwhile team. We could have gone together.
Well, he's got a lot of book knowledge about the Savage Lands
That's
and
true.
the X-Men. He thinks he can translate it to practical experience and...
I mean, if I'm being honest, if I had to choose someone from the Radio Meanwhile network to go to the Savage Lands, it would be Eric. Yeah, I think so.
I don't...
Oh, really?
Well, I mean, he won't have his mutant power, and
True.
he's probably just going to show up now and then, aside from the regular storyline,
Yeah.
and be swinging from vines and
Yeah.
meeting up with random people from the Savage Land that we don't know anything about yet.
I still think he can do it.
Okay, well, I guess all we can do is just let him,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Well, what are we going to do? What about Comic Book Coffee Break? What about Previously on X-Men?
Did you want to talk about Time Fugitives?
I could. I haven't watched those episodes since the early 90s, though.
Well, what if
Okay.
we call up Alex Irvine
Oh.
and have a little chat with
Interesting.
him about
Alex,
his X-Men
Yes.
stuff.
Yes. And, Alex Irvine has written a plethora of novelizations, and I've read every novelization
in existence,
ever.
I think. Yes.
So, yeah, I'd totally be down to talk to Alex Irvine. Right now?
Well, I mean, if you're here.
Like I said, I'm free as a bird. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, today we're going to be talking to Alex Irvine. He's a best-selling author whose work for Marvel includes original tie-in fiction featuring Iron Man and the Ultimates, comic book runs on Hellstrom, Iron Man, and Daredevil, a Haynes-style guide on Marvel vehicles, as well as adapting epic comic book arcs to novel form, including Secret Wars and X-Men Days of Future Past.
Oh, I love me some time
I
travel.
don't know if you've heard of that.
I have, yes. Yeah, I'm a fan.
He has also written the script for over a dozen Marvel games,
Ooh.
which is a thing that people do.
Apparently.
So let's see if he's available. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Hillary. How you doing?
Hi, nice to meet you.
You too.
Thanks for chatting with us. Seems like you're pretty wrapped up in the Marvel world these days. Your work goes back with them pretty far. How'd you get started working with Marvel?
Well, so I was doing a reading of a short story, actually, at the KGB bar, part of their science fiction reading series, and it was right when my third novel, I guess, The Narrows, had just come out. Mm-hmm. And so I was talking with some friends after the reading, and one of them was like, hey, a friend of mine who works for Marvel is over at this other bar across the street. And so we went over and talked to him, and he asked me if I'd ever thought about writing comics. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, I had thought about writing comics. And that led to various conversations. And so then I wrote this Damon Hellstrom comic called Equinox. And that was my first Marvel comic, and I was so thrilled to do it. And then after that came Daredevil and Iron Man books, and then I started working at Marvel Games and all the novelizations. And so, but it all started with, just this kind of chance conversation, because I'd always wanted to write comics, but never knew how to get into it.
Yeah.
And I later learned that what you're supposed to do is just do a bunch of comics and self-publish them and build things that way. And that's how almost everybody else did it. But I kind of accidentally did that backwards.
Huh. You say everyone else did that, but it seems like everybody has a story like that where they just sort of tripped into it.
I think it's more common recently, because Marvel started around this time when I first started working for them. They started like reaching out to novelists and people who were writing in other forms and actively kind of recruiting them in, which I don't think they'd been doing before.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Now, the Hellstrom book, that was part of the Max imprint, right?
It was.
That's more like Marvel's edgier, grown-up. Did you find, was that a more freeing process? I mean, did you have less restraints because of that?
Oh yeah, and it works really well for the Hellstrom character because it's about this sort of demonic invasion of New Orleans, and so there's blood and guts, and then Isis is wandering around naked, and so it's she's looking for Osiris, specifically the one piece of him she hasn't been able to find, which she thinks is in New Orleans somewhere.
Okay.
It's basically like writing a Vertigo book.
Yeah.
There's
Right.
Your leash is totally off, and you could basically do whatever you want.
So that must open things up creatively for you.
Yeah. And so, it's really different from writing for the sort of core Marvel universes where everything is PG or maybe PG-13 if you really, really get lucky.
Well, we are an X-Men podcast, so I'm going to go straight for your Days of Future Past adaptation. In 2014, you got the Days of Future Past movie, and then kind of separately, I guess, you released this novelization of that classic comic arc. Can you tell me about that? I mean, novelizations are so interesting, how you have to kind of take the visual and make it internal and see kind of that side of the characters and the events. What is that like?
Well, for Days of Future Past, it was a really interesting process. I mean, the other one of those I did was Secret War, and that was 12 issues of material to work with. So at least there's a lot of sort of armature to build the story on.
Yeah.
Days of Future Past is 2 issues. And so I read them. I mean, I'd read them before, but when they asked me if I wanted to do this book, I was like, I remember that story being pretty short. I better go check it out. And I read through it, and I thought, yeah, okay, I'll figure this out. This will be fun. And I realized pretty quickly that there wasn't nearly enough story in those 2 issues to carry a novel.
Yeah.
And I also realized that for all the story's impact, because Claremont always really keyed into what made the X-Men cool, and this sense of oppression and alienation and all that. But I thought there was one huge thing that was missing from the comic, because there's Magneto in his wheelchair, right? But here's also a Magneto who has powers over all things metallic, and the enemy is a bunch of robots.
Yep.
Why on earth, when they escape the camp, do they leave him behind?
Yeah.
So I reread the comic like 8 or 10 times, honestly, trying to see if there was like some reason that was hinted at in there that I missed, and I never could find it. So I thought, okay, that's my way in. So my whole approach to the thing was that they realized that if they can spring Magneto and get his collar off, that's going to change everything. And so then the book, in addition to the stuff like the scenes where Wolverine gets fried and all that, those are all in there because they're so emotional.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to add this idea where Magneto gets to, and also Magneto essentially gets to do the thing that he never got to do in Auschwitz.
Yeah, I thought that was a cool thing.
And I wanted him to have that,
Yeah.
and on the good guy side. And so there's the scene at the end of the book where he just kind of annihilates the Baxter Building and everything in it. And I hope that's not too much of a spoiler. The book's been out for like 7 years. And what was funny is that when the book came out, people who really knew the comic, like beat to beat to beat, were like, "Hey, wait a second, that didn't happen." But a lot of people who had read the comic just were like, "This is a really good adaptation," and I took this as a compliment because I took that to mean that they thought that what I did with the story actually fit.
Yeah.
And I don't know how Claremont would feel about it if he ever read it. I imagine he would hate it. But
He'd probably be grumpy about it, I feel like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And so that was the emotional core of the story to me, was like, it's this last stand, but the last stand involves this like super weapon that if only we can get this thing cranked up and out and into the battlefield, maybe we can survive.
Yeah.
So that was fun.
Hillary, going back to what you said about how you're seeing like what's happening internally like play out on the page, that was something I feel like in the novelization that Kitty Pryde really got in a way that she doesn't get in those 2 issues. I mean,
definitely.
Alex, I think the way that you really explore, I mean, she's a teenager changing places with her adult persona who lives in a hellscape, and like having going both ways is like a very emotionally traumatic scene, and I feel like that's kind of glazed over in the comics because again it's only 2 issues. What did you put into really like working out how the different Kitty Prydes would feel about that experience?
Well, that was the other real immediate key was I thought that because the movie came out and it was not a Kitty Pryde story at all,
Right.
and that was irritating, and
Yes.
because she's and
No, she
because
sits in a room, right? Kitty Pryde in the movie sits in a room.
it's totally about her.
Yeah.
Really. No, and because she's a fascinating character,
Yeah.
And so this idea that you project this kid into this hellscape, as you say, and basically she has to convince everybody of what's happened, and kind of the fate of the world is resting on her shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And she's in a body that is, and Marvel wouldn't let me lean too heavily into this, she's in a body that is really different than the one that she's accustomed to living in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was a particularly interesting element, just her noticing, like, I'm now in this completely different, just being in someone else's body, basically.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Marvel was nervous about that stuff because I think they didn't want me to talk about, like, I don't know, menstruation or something. But, so I tried to do it in a way that that would really get at the experience of, insofar as you can, of being not exactly a child, but a youngish adolescent who is all of a sudden in an adult body. And the flip side of it too is, can you imagine adult Kate Pryde, all of a sudden 15 again?
Mm-hmm.
She's got all of her own minds and experiences, but she's running them through a teenage brain.
Yeah.
That's it's got to be insane.
Yeah.
Because all teenagers are insane,
That's right.
And that part of the book was really fun to do. And as you say, it's easier to get into in a book because in prose fiction you can get at what's interior in a way that it's more difficult to do in a comic. And that's one of the things that I always try to look for in a novelization is let the novel do the things that novels do well that the other mediums don't do as well.
Yeah.
Like a novel is never going to be as visual as a movie or a comic. So you can describe things vividly.
Yeah.
But it's not going to land in the reader's actual visual cortex.
Right. Yeah.
And so what novels are good at is putting you inside people's heads.
Well, I mean, as someone who had written comics at this point, do you think that helps with adapting it from a comic to a novel?
Probably. I think having written comics definitely makes you understand how they work better. I mean, that obviously. But I think I've understood since I was a kid that books and comics were better at different kinds of storytelling.
Yeah.
And because I read a lot of novelizations when I was a kid too, and so it became clear pretty quick. Like I would see a movie and read the novelization, and even if I wouldn't have been able to articulate it when I was 12, I was already starting to understand that these different forms of creative expression were good at different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you take any visual medium and adapt it into a novel, one of the first things you have to do is go interior, and one of the other things you have to do is open it up and let it breathe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because comics and movies are such compressed forms of storytelling that I think prose fiction gives you a lot more room to change your rhythms and to find different modes of expression that don't involve just trying to get the reader to turn the next page.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to talk to somebody who's done so many different forms of literature and all of the adapting between different, the kind of perspective you have to have is very interesting. You've done these movie novelizations and you're still working on some. Is that, I mean, I'm sure it's a similar thing, but how would you compare adapting a movie from adapting a comic?
Yeah. So there's never enough story in a movie to sustain a novel. And so doing a novelization of a movie is always about going deeper. And then the tricky bit is that somebody at the studio is always reading the book, and you have to figure out, and this is different every time. You have to figure out what they're comfortable with and what they want you to explore and what they don't want you to explore, and how you can work with those preferences and still also find a way to make the book an interesting thing for you to do and follow your own interests.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've written so many movie novelizations at this point. Actually, I haven't worked on one in a couple of years now, and it's been have been kind of confused. I'm like, why am I not doing them? Because it was kind of like all I did for a while.
Yeah.
But I got so busy with games that I haven't been able to do any of them lately. the thing that a movie novelization, I think, can be really good at is kind of show you the story behind the story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're going to hit the big battles. There's also, in a big action movie, there's always the one scene that is designed to give you the thumbnail sketches of the personalities of all the supporting characters.
Yeah.
And it's that, like the dorm scene in Pacific Rim,
Mm-hmm.
where they're all playing cards and doing like acrobatics and whatever, and they give the new kid a hard time.
You have to. Like in New Orleans.
Right. And so those kind of things, I think they essentially just add a lot of texture to a story, and especially a story that is coming from a big action movie. And those are, the novelizations that I've done. If I was novelizing, like, I don't know, a romantic comedy or something like that, I imagine it would be different. But
Yeah, probably.
is there a novelization of When Harry Met Sally? I mean,
if there was, I would have read it, because I
probably,
read
right?
all novelizations as a child. Let's talk a little bit about your work novelizing the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because I was a little surprised when these started. Honestly, I knew that you'd done the Iron Man 2 novelization back when that movie came out, but I was surprised that Marvel was moving to make these novelizations kind of retroactively so long after the fact. How did that come about? And were you always slated to just write them all, or how did that all happen?
Well, so I think I ended up doing 13 of those, or 15?
There's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did the Iron Man 2 book kind of at the last minute.
Okay.
That was my very first movie novelization. I'd done licensed fiction before. I'd done a Batman book and some other stuff. But I got this call from an editor at Little Brown, and they went and they needed someone to novelize Iron Man 2, and they needed someone to novelize Iron Man 2 like yesterday, but they wouldn't send me the script.
Oh.
I was going to be in New York in a couple of weeks anyway, so I was like, well, can I bring down my laptop and take some notes? And she was like, oh, you can read it, but you can't bring a computer into the room.
Oh, wow.
And I said, well, what am I
Lock
supposed
and key. Jeez.
Later, it got easier to get access to scripts, but this first one was kind of crazy, and so I ended up having to sit in a room at Marvel. And this, I was doing other work for Marvel. It wasn't like they didn't know who I was.
Right. Yeah.
But I had to sit in a conference room at the old Marvel HQ that had windows on all four walls while somebody walked around outside, and I took handwritten notes.
Whoa, wild.
Wow.
And
on Iron Man 2, it's not even like we're talking about, Avengers Endgame or something where there's huge spoilers or something. Iron Man 2, that's really interesting.
It was. And the process changed after that, but it was so weird too, because basically what I did was I sat down in this conference room and I transcribed all the movie's dialogue.
Oh my gosh.
Because it was the only way I could think of to get enough notes to actually make it happen. And wrote little notes to myself about, what was happening. And Tony falls out of a butt and all that.
So just like you in a big room full of windows, transcribing the script with a pencil and a spiral notebook? I mean...
Yeah, a couple of legal pads.
Wow.
And so then I went home and I wrote the book, and I turned it in, and I got a call from somebody at studios, and they were like, well, this stuff is all wrong. And I said, well, it's what's in the script. And they were like, oh, well, there's been all kinds of revisions to the
Oh,
script.
my gosh.
Cool.
And I said, well, one approach would be to tell me about this.
Right.
And
it's an option.
Yeah, I mean, And so I said, okay, well, cool. Send me the new pages and I'll make it work, because I was trying to please everybody. I'd never done one of these before, and I wanted to make a good impression and all that. And he was like, oh, no, I can't send you the pages, but I'll tell you what happened. I said, wait, you'll tell me what happened? And then I was like, no, I can't. I mean, I'm not putting my name on this book.
Yeah.
If I can't
wow.
even see what's going to be in the story that I'm supposed to be telling. It all ended up fine, but this was right as I don't know if Disney had bought studios yet. It was right around that time. But anyway, there was a lot going on, and everybody was kind of jumpy, and so. And it was also right after Iron Man had come out, and they were starting to plan for the MCU. And so, anyway, after that, the process got a lot easier. But it was 3 or 4 years, I think, before I started writing the all ages ones.
Yeah.
And those came about just in a different way. That was an editor at a different publisher too. She they had the license. They had the license to do YA, or not YA, all ages novelizations of the movies, and so. I was 5 or 6 movies behind when I started working on those. Yeah. And so it was super fun because if the movie had been out for a while, then I could just watch it a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then as I got more and more caught up on them, and they were trying to release them closer to the movie's date, then there was the script access question again, and it got easier, and so I could get a look at an online copy of the script and
Okay.
have it to refer to.
Okay.
So those were super fun to write too, because they were supposed to be about 30,000 words long. Some of them were longer than that because there was more story, and I just got interested in tangents, and
right.
so I ran with them. And they really wanted them to have an all ages kind of feel, and I got to flex some different writing muscles, because when you're writing with that audience in mind, you prioritize different things.
Yeah.
So yeah, those books were really fun. And then I think the last one I did was Spider-Man: Homecoming.
Okay.
And then for whatever reason, I don't know if it was an argument over the license or Little Brown just decided not to publish those anymore, but they stopped doing them. And so that Spider-Man book exists, but it'll probably never be published.
Huh.
That's a bummer.
Yeah, really. So how far back does your personal history with Marvel go? Like, were you a comic book fan? Were you an X-Men fan growing up?
I liked the X-Men, but I was Spider-Man and Doctor Strange.
Okay.
Were my guys when I was a kid. And also, weirdly, the Marvel license books, like ROM. I
remember ROM. Yeah. ROM Space Knight, sure.
And the Micronauts. And Godzilla, when there were those Godzilla comics coming out. I could not get enough of those.
Wow.
So those were, the stuff from 80, 81, 82.
Mm-hmm.
Those are, and then, like a lot of kids, I got away from comics a little bit in high school because I was trying to be cool. And then in college, I kind of started to circle back into comics by way of indie comics and stuff.
Oh, okay.
All
right.
So when I first started writing Marvel stuff, I hadn't been an active reader of Marvel comics in quite some time. And so I was coming at these Marvel books with Steve Ditko in my head.
Yeah.
And so I have since done a whole lot of catching up, and every comic I ever write aspires to the condition of a 1982 Doctor Strange comic.
Nice.
Now we'll have to look for that.
I know. Yeah, we'll have to go and find it. Definitely.
Oh, you'll know them when you see them.
Yeah.
The ones with all the kooky psychedelic art and they're fantastic.
Yep.
Oh, that's funny. Well, like I said, I'm really interested in how you insert all of the internal stuff. And something I'm interested in is you go back to some X-Men characters in the Secret Wars novelization. I mean, it's the sprawling everybody, but there are a couple in there, Storm, Colossus, that you go back to. Did you feel any connection to the Days of Future Past characters, or is it just sort of something you do each project in isolation?
I was trying to keep those apart because I don't think, if I used one story to refer to the other, I try to stay away from establishing continuities. Actually, I try to stay away from establishing continuity at all costs at any time, because because continuity is a prison.
It's a lot to hold on to.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time comics are better if they don't try to hold on to it. All comics should be just Adventure Time, where everything starts fresh at the beginning of every episode, but they're not. And those long-running sagas actually can be really fun, but but after a while, there's 1,000 issues of a comic behind you, then what do you do now?
Yeah.
You can definitely get trapped.
Yep. But the characters' sort of interior lives in Secret Wars is really different because, everybody is forced into this position of not knowing who they can rely on. But the most fun of that whole book is writing Claw, because the Claw in Secret Wars is just so insane, and so I picked that up and just ran with it.
That's an 80s character for you right there, that characterization, definitely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the comics here, because I know you've done a lot of comic book work as well. Fred Van Lente was on the show early on. He was talking about his work on X-Men Noir, and your Daredevil Noir came right on the heels of that. And Daredevil is so well suited for that style. But I'm wondering how you approached adapting that character and some of the changes that you made. Just what was that process like?
Right when I was finishing up working on the Hellstorm book, I was talking to Axel about what to do next. And he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do a Daredevil book." And I had this idea for a Daredevil book, and we batted some stuff back and forth for a while. And he said, "Well, that sounds like it might be a noir book. And I did not know the noir thing was happening at this point. But then they explained to me they were doing all this, Spider-Man and Iron Man noir. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, I can rewrite it for that. And in fact, that makes it easier to do this other thing that I was planning to do. And so then I went off and reimagined the story as taking place during Prohibition, and switched around Bullseye and did some other things that were kind of ripped from the headlines of 1931. Yeah. So that was fun. And then he got Tom to draw it. And when I first started seeing Tom's art, I was like, oh, this is really coming together in a way that I had never imagined, Yeah. I had this fight scene in mind. And so I wrote this huge, detailed 2 or 3 page sequence where Daredevil fights all these bad guys in this brewery, and chaos, everything flying everywhere. And I had it all choreographed down to, every punch, every kick, and all this stuff. Because I had just started writing comics and I didn't know any better, essentially.
Yeah.
And Tom calls me up, and it was the first time we'd ever talked on the phone.
Okay.
And we chatted for a while, and then he says, "Hey, so I'm looking at this fight scene that you wrote in this issue, and just so you know, a lot of time a writer will just kind of go like they fight."
Insert fight here.
And I was like, oh, and that book just came together so nicely, and it was, the alt covers that Dennis Calero did were cool too.
Yeah.
And
the whole tone works really well for it.
You mentioned earlier your changes with Bullseye, and I loved the direction that you went with that. Did you have any trouble with that? Any pushback with a big change like that?
I mean, I would send in my breakdowns for the issues and tell them what I wanted to do, and they I didn't get any pushback at all on that. Axel was always super flexible about stuff like that.
Okay.
And I was throwing some other story ideas at him too about Doctor Strange. Yeah. I pestered Axel to write a Doctor Strange comic forever, and then, but it never worked out before he moved on to become editor-in-chief and then left. But yeah, there was. I felt like I had a lot of room within the noir confines because the story that I really wanted to tell is basically how in this hero and villain ecology. I mean, what's a hero without a villain? And that's. I did not invent this story. It's been told a zillion times before. But the particular way that Daredevil and the Kingpin interact has always fascinated me.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to explore that a little bit and use these other characters as a way to get at it.
Yeah, the frame story with Daredevil and Kingpin I thought was really effective.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a very strong ending. I like that quite a bit.
I'm glad to hear that because that's one of my favorite parts of the book. And it's the soul of the book to me is that confrontation, that conversation.
Yeah.
And that conversation, and that interplay between doubt and faith and hope, which is, to my mind, what Daredevil's character has always been about. And I wanted to bring that out.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. It's just interesting, the noir line, I feel like each author sort of takes it and runs with it in a different way. When Fred was on and asked him about the process of adapting X-Men, he dropped the bomb that he hates writing the X-Men. So that was that was fun, kind of a fun twist to learn on an X-Men podcast. I was not asking the questions, just quietly recording and stifling my laughter as... he dropped that bomb on poor Eric, who was leading that interview. But yeah, it's a fun line all around. Let's talk a little bit about some of your game work, because I feel like that I don't even understand that process, like how you go about writing the scripts for the games. And the X-Men are featured pretty heavily in that. I know, like Puzzle Quest, for example, you get a lot of Storm and you get a lot of Wolverine, in particular dialogue. So how do you go about writing a script for a game like that?
Oh man, I mean, so I've written like 9 games for Marvel at this point, and every one of them has been different. Puzzle Quest tends to be pretty short, contained mission scripts, and in fact, I've been doing mostly battle games out of Asia right now, which is super fun. There's one called Marvel Super War and one called Marvel Duel. Those are both out right now, and I got another one that is not a card game. It's a different kind of fighting game that I think comes out next year. Anyway, I've been writing dialogues and story for that for the last year or so. But yeah, every game is different. The first Marvel game I wrote was Avengers Alliance, and that was a super fun experience because it was a Facebook game. And initially, the developer really did not want there to be story in it. They just wanted to roll the characters out and have them fight.
Okay.
And then Marvel reminded them that Marvel was about characters and story, and so they were like, "I'll
find kind of a crucial element." Yeah.
Yeah. So Marvel made them go find a writer, and it ended up being me.
Mm-hmm.
At first, they were like, okay, you get 2 or 3 lines of dialogue every mission. And I said, well, but I can't tell a story in 2 or 3 lines of dialogue. I mean, I'm pretty concise when I need to be, but that's asking a lot.
Yeah, really.
And so we went round and round and round, and eventually the story really started to expand. And then when players started to respond to it, because there was this idea that a Facebook game couldn't have story in it because story would slow down clicks, and that would slow down monetization, and that would screw up all their engagement numbers, and they were terrified of this. And I said, no, this is Marvel, man. This is not just a cow clicker.
Yeah, well, that's what you want. That's what you want.
Yeah.
You want those characters. You want to hear them sound like they sound and talk like they talk.
Yeah, and I said, this is a different kind of investment because they're used to trying to generate the click and reward, like dopamine.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, that's one kind of investment, yes, but you get emotional investment if you actually have characters in a story. Trust me on this. And they did not trust me on this at first, or you know, and it wasn't just me, you know, I'm not alone evangelizing this, but that was the tenor of the conversations was between people who believed in the Marvel story angle of it, and this other part of the team that was really out of the mobile game analytics, maximize click and reward and return, and watching those two conversations swirl around each other and then eventually connect was a really interesting part of that first game.
That is interesting.
And then 75 million people played the game, and it ran for 4.5 years. So it worked out, and you know, and I wrote, I think, 40,000 lines of dialogue for that game.
Oh, jeez.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an
including
increase.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. And there's a lot of X-Men in there. And it was funny how, because the video game rights for Marvel characters were really complicated for a while. They're less so now. But there were certain characters I could never use, even though I begged for them. And then there were certain characters that I couldn't use at first. And then 2 years later, they were, guess what? We got rights to this character. And then
it's back.
Yay. But the process of writing for games it's different for every game. But by and large, the process goes like, okay, we have this part of the game, and these are the characters we want to feature. And we have about this much room for the story. Write us something. And so then I write something, and the game team looks at it, and you know, I'm always working with the team at Marvel Games, and so we go round and round, and everybody gets aligned on what we want from the game and what we want from the characters, and then at some point the dialogue ends up in the game through processes that are inscrutable to me. And like I'm working on a game right now that has some alternate universe versions of Marvel characters. Wicked fun, super fun.
Cool.
But it's really making me take a step back and say, okay, I've been thinking about this character in this certain way. While I've been writing him for the last 12 years, and now I got to do it a little bit different. So
that's cool.
So it's great, and it's refreshing, and it gives me a chance to flex some different muscles and get out of my own bad habit.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm enjoying it. And the other thing about writing games is that because you have to be so creative and flexible in finding storytelling strategies, that now when I sit down and write a novel or a comic or something like that, then I'm thinking of all these different possible ways to do that too. Like everything I do in a different creative form, whether you know it's a comic script, a game, or animation, or a novel, or something else. All those things, they nourish each other. And I know people who really don't like to work outside of one particular mode. And I don't understand that because I find them all so interesting.
Well, and the way they relate to each other and change your skill and change your approach on all the projects, I feel like would be pretty beneficial. When it comes to utilizing the X-Men, like in your game scripts, are there members that you particularly enjoy writing for?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a soft spot for Nightcrawler.
Oh yeah, he was my favorite as a child. Yeah.
I wanted to do a noir Nightcrawler actually.
That would work.
Yeah, it was going to be called BAMF, but it was going to be an acronym for Badass Motherfucker.
That's pretty awesome.
And I never got to do that, and probably never will. But I cherish the idea.
Well, if that happens, you have to come back and talk to us again. I feel like we have to lock that in right here, right now.
And you know, some of the other X-Men are fun to write just because of their dialogue quirks.
Definitely.
You know, Wolverine's always fun to write, and so you know, I mean, unlike Fred, I enjoy writing the X-Men. But I think that may be because I didn't drowned myself in X-Men comics when I was 14,
Okay.
and which Fred did.
Okay. Well, there we go.
And so I don't feel the weight of all the other people who have written X-Men, like
Yeah.
the way that other writers might, who were more into those comics when they were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just write them and have fun with them, and then, you know, like I said, probably Claremont would be mad, but but that's okay because the characters live.
Yeah.
And they go on and they do new things.
Yeah.
I kind of like Colossus too because of his. And Beast.
Yeah.
Beast is another one.
Yeah.
Because I'm a sucker for characters in any medium who randomly quote obscure literary things because I do that.
Always fun.
And anytime you can write a character and throw in like lines of Renaissance poetry.
Yeah. And that's like 90% of Beast's dialogue in the 90s cartoon. It's just all...
Does he say anything that's not?
No, I think it's only literary quotes.
All right, well, I think that's all the stuff we had to talk about. I'm really glad we got a chance to chat.
I am too. This was a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah. Will, do you have any upcoming Marvel work you can tease?
Well, just the games right now. I'm working on... I got up to my eyeballs in games, and I'm looking forward to getting back to comics.
Yeah.
But I'm writing 3 games for Marvel right now.
Oh my gosh.
So once those get a little bit more manageable, then it's more comics for me, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Where can people find you if they're looking for your work online?
Well, if they were looking for me online, there's a website, alex-irvine.com. And I'm on Twitter, Alex Irvine, and Facebook. Always happy to gab about anything with people who stop by the online spaces.
Well, thanks again for chatting. It was really great hearing your process and everything.
Well, thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.
All right, bye-bye.
So long.
That was great. That was such a fun thing to talk to him about.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever talked to anybody before who has that kind of adapting from comic to book, from book to comic, from movie to book to all over the place.
Well, that's the thing. He's adapting in every direction. And I really was interested in what he was saying about how writing the games, like the way that you have to sort of think on the fly and adapt, how that influences his other work as well. Like he takes these things that he learns from working in these different mediums, and rather than just being like, oh, that's a game thing, it has kind of melded with the way he just writes in general. It
informs, his process and everything. It's cool.
And I think the thoughtfulness of his novelizations really does come across. These MCU novelizations are, I mean, they're geared towards a younger audience, but I've read several of them because, as you know, I mean, if there's a novelization,
guy,
you know what I mean. I've read the novelization of Battleship, Hillary. Okay,
that's not a thing that should exist.
But the thing is, like in novelization, sometimes it can just sort of be like, all right, they took the dialogue and they added scenes just to get you from point A to point B.
Yeah,
his all really read like full novels, which I think is just so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he really goes into the value of a novelization.
Yeah.
Which is to translate what you get from the screen into actually the written format and taking advantage of the opportunities that gives you.
Well, I think so often they can be treated just like a byproduct of the movie,
right.
And I think that it's clear the care he takes when he does that, whether it's adapting a movie or adapting comic runs. I mean, I was pretty impressed with the Days of Future Past adaptation just because, as he said, I mean, it is a very short story.
2 issues.
And it's such a legendary story, like in the X-Men canon. It's like everybody is aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's because of the animated series episodes or, now with the movie, of course. But like that's always been one of those ones that people kind of hold up there.
Yep.
And so for him to go through and really like take point by point the things that made that work and expand it, I think it's just it's a good use of that story and those characters.
Yeah. And I think, getting the inside scoop on how they're all thinking and like what the real plans are and everything. I think a lot of the time with Days of Future Past, it's such a big story and it's so focused on like, I don't want to say hijinks because it's not fun like that, but like the action.
Yeah. Well,
you kind of, I mean, it does have implications for those characters and the psychology and everything, and that's...
I think you completely lose in the story. You don't get the sense of what Kitty Pryde is really going through by switching places the way that she does.
Yeah.
And I think, because how could you? It's a 2-issue comic, but the way he made that like an integral part of the story, I thought really added to it. And I agree with the idea that it is a good adaptation, even though it adds a lot, because everything that's added feels so organic to the story.
Yeah.
It feels like what he did would have been in the comic if they had more space and more time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and adding in all the stuff about Magneto and kind of giving him a lot of agency in it and connecting it to kind of his history and everything, I think was really just, I mean, he just uses that opportunity. He does. He takes it and
I feel like a recommendation of a novelization from me is sort of meaningless, but I do feel like if you're a fan of the Days of Future Past comic, there's plenty in the novelization that makes it worth the read. Like even if you're already familiar with the story, I think it is really, like, for an X-Men fan, I think would be you get a lot out of reading it.
I mean, like you said, everybody loves Days of Future Past. We don't actually have a lot of fleshed out stuff for it, so I mean, take it.
The novelizations for the MCU right now are coming out. They've been translated into German and are slowly coming out over there. And I did find one interesting fact. This Spider-Man Homecoming novelization that he mentioned did actually come out in late 2020, but in German. There's no U.S. release. So at least it saw the light of day somewhere.
Somewhere.
You know, so that's cool.
We can all do Google Translate and read that book.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thanks again to Alex Irvine for the great chat. And thank you, Nick, for hopping on with me again. And
absolutely.
Where can people find you?
Well, right here on the Radio Meanwhile Network, I'm the host of 90210 Here We Go, a 90210 rewatch podcast. Probably not a lot of crossover between the X-Men fandom and the 90210 fandom.
I don't know. You'd be surprised. I love that show.
Okay. I'm also the host of How's Things, the official podcast and radio show of the David A. Howe Public Library, which you can find at soundcloud.com/allthebooks. And if you enjoyed this talk with Alex Irvine, I'm going to be talking to him about some of his non-Marvel work, including the nonfiction graphic novels, The Comic Book History of Baseball, and The Far Side of the Moon, the story of Apollo 11's Third Man. Also his recent sci-fi novel, The Anthropocene Rag. So again, you can find that at soundcloud.com/allthebooks.
Are you proud of yourself every time you say Anthropocene?
I am, because because I was sweating it. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for pointing out my pronunciation.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Well, next time, as promised and not fulfilled this time, we will be returning to season 2 of the X-Men animated series with the 2-parter Time Fugitives.
More time travel.
Yes.
I love it.
You love time travel.
I know.
Thank you to Prophetic Music for our theme song, which I just love every time I hear it.
Yeah, it is good.
You can find more about this show and others like it at our network's website, radiomeanwhile.com, and follow us on Twitter at Previously on X. Please rate, subscribe, and share this show, please, wherever you get your podcasts. Now, I've got to go download the Cerebro app and see if I can get a beat on Eric.
Oh, that's a good idea. I knew there was a problem when I saw his bowl of taco rice untouched. Is it?